Well, thank you so much, Mr. Williams, for doing this. It's an honor, and I have sort of made it my mission to go around and try to meet World War II veterans and tell their stories, because I feel like the younger generation today has been given a lot, and it's you and all of your brothers and sisters that have given it to them, your generation. And so I've tried to go around and meet as many veterans as I can and try to tell their stories. But you obviously have, in my opinion, the greatest of all stories. And so to meet you and be able to talk to you is a true honor.
Well, thank you very much for that. We're getting scarce. I read different figures, but the last figure I read was 1,000 a day. World War II guys are going away. But all of them are up in their 90s, so it's to be expected. That's the way God planned it.
Well, the youngest of you guys now, I know some guys lied about their ages, but
Yeah.
if you were 18 at the end of the war, you'd be, 94 right now?
Yeah. I was 19. I tried to go at 18, but they wouldn't accept me at that point, not because of my age, but because of my height.
Understood.
Yeah.
Because you were, and let me get this right, at that point, the Marine Corps, you had to be 5'8".
That's correct.
And you were 5'6".
That's right.
That's right.
Yeah. So then when they realized they're going to have more people because we're losing them, then they lowered the height requirement. So I had to be, I was 19 in October and went in May of the following year.
And so before we get started, I had to mention this, but you just had a pretty incredible day recently with our president.
Yes, I did.
That was a couple weeks ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, about 3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And that was for VJ Day.
Yeah.
Right, to honor VJ Day.
Correct.
Just talk a few minutes about that, because it looked pretty. I saw pictures that were posted online. It looked like a pretty amazing day.
It was. Yeah, that was quite a surprise when I got the invitation to come to the White House. And Air Force One was mentioned, but I didn't know that I was actually going to be able to get on the Air Force One and go someplace.
Wow.
So when we arrived there, of course, and then they gave us a schedule, why it indicated we were going to fly down to Wilmington, North Carolina, and probably that was the most exciting thing that happened. Yet the president's up front of the aircraft, and we're in a boardroom in the back, so there's no way we can associate with him while aboard the plane. But I think, to my mind, even as great as that was, the most memorable minute to me is being in the Oval Office.
Wow.
We went out first in the Rose Garden, and
I saw some of those pictures.
Yeah, they were doing an interview out there, and we talked out there for a while. Then we went into the Oval Office, which I never dreamed we would do, and walked in, and he sat down in his chair at the desk that he normally sits at, and he said that he had two things that he wanted to present, or two things to present to me, and I had a choice. I could take either one. And so they were in a beautiful box, wooden box, and he opened them up, and of course one was the Presidential Medallion,
Wow.
and the other was the key to the White House. And he said, you can have either one. And my response was at the time, I'll take the medallion because I have keys at home I don't think I used a number at that time, but I have about 7 keys at home to various cities in West Virginia, and they won't fit a thing. So I didn't figure the key to the White House would open anything, so I'll take the medallion.
Oh my gosh.
And so that was okay. And I said, but I'd like to have my grandson, who's with me, to have the key. So
And that was Brent.
that was Brent. So he got the key. Yes.
Oh, that's wonderful.
That was an exciting moment.
My wife and I, Kristen and I, were talking, and we both agree that you should run for president.
Oh, no. I wouldn't want that job.
Boy, and you're too honest for that. You're way too honest for that. But I'm 99% sure you would be elected if you ran. Well, that was a pretty neat experience, though.
It was. Yes.
It looked like, and well deserved.
Once in a lifetime.
My take on that is I think I was telling Brent or Chad, but you should legitimately have a key to the White House. You should, with all that you've done for our nation, you should be able to go to the White House whenever you want to. You should have a room there at the White House if you want to. But
Well, we have been to the White House a number of times over the years. We used to, before limitations became prevalent in how many people could be in a room because of regulations. We used to go there about every award of a Medal of Honor recipient,
wow.
and there would be 40 or 50 or 60 of us there at one time.
Wow.
But after they put limitations on how many people could be in a room, then they started reducing the number of people that, or recipients that could be there. And finally ended up 10 was the most we could have. And of course, they would always send out a notice, and then the recipients would answer, I want to go or I don't want to go. But they usually get more than the 10.
Sure.
So somebody had to make a decision, well, who goes and who doesn't go.
Sure.
But we've been there for a number of times at those awards. And the last 3 or 4, I haven't been able to be there.
Well, that's a tremendous honor. Like I said, you've been through so much and done so much. I think you should have a permanent room there. But that's just me. That's just my opinion. I was gonna I was gonna ask you a little bit about your childhood and your background. And I knew you grew up here, and I've got some notes here. That's why I keep looking over. But you were born in Quiet Dell, West Virginia,
right?
Which is more central West Virginia,
more northern type. Yeah, there are. And this gets a little confusing, but there are 2 Quiet Dell communities in the state.
Interesting.
One is in Harrison County, Clarksburg area, and the other one's in Marion County, the Fairmont area.
Okay.
And so I'm from the Fairmont area, Marion County area. And the one in Quiet Dell, Harrison County is a little bigger than one in Marion County, but they're both out in the countryside, if you would. Yeah.
And you were born in 1923, I believe.
Correct.
1923,
yes.
And your family were dairy farmers.
Correct.
And you were one of 11 children, although several of your siblings didn't survive to adulthood because of the flu.
Because of the flu, and some of them died at birth.
Sure.
We had, I was the last of the 11.
Okay.
And we never had a doctor for any one of the 11. No doctor was ever in attendance.
Wow.
And because doctors were very scarce, or very few at that time, and we were about 7.5 miles out in the country. And transportation back in the teens of 1918 and 20, and even in 23, was very limited. Most people didn't have an automobile.
Wow.
And so doctors were pretty well limited to the community where they were living.
Understood.
And the doctor they did finally get a doctor about 3 days after I was born, because I only weighed 3 pounds.
Wow.
And most babies at 3 pounds really did not survive. But, and they weren't quite sure whether I was or not, and that's why they finally got the doctor to come. And apparently he said, well, looks like he's going to make it. And my mother, at that point in time, apparently had not come up with a name for me. So when the doctor came, his name was Hershel Yost.
Interesting.
And so she used his name to give to me. And it's spelled without a C. His name was spelled without a C. So my name was spelled without a C.
Interesting.
Hershel, no C in there. And my father was apparently an admirer of Woodrow Wilson. So I got the name Woodrow as a middle name.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, but there was my mother was kind of like a midwife, if you would. She and another lady by the name of Myrtle Corbin, who lived about a half a mile from us in the same community area. Both of them were kind of midwives. When somebody was having a baby, they would usually call Mom or Myrtle to come at the childbirth. So Mom attended most of Myrtle's, and Myrtle attended most of Mom's. Myrtle had 13 children.
Wow.
And naturally they did all they could, but sometimes they couldn't do the impossible.
Sure, understood. And it was pretty common in that generation for parents to have larger families because they needed help,
That's right.
Working.
That's exactly right.
And your family had a dairy farm,
Yes.
and so you grew up probably working on the dairy farm.
No, yeah, I did. Yeah, I was, as we said, I was the youngest. But as the children came along, we were milking 25 to 35 head of cows twice a day.
Wow.
I've never understood why we couldn't have done it one time a day and been satisfied with that, but it had to be done 2 times a day.
Had to be done twice a day, right?
Yeah, it had to be done. So, but as the children came along and then the boys grew into teenage years, or even high years before teenage, you got duty assignments.
Sure.
You got these particular duties and you're responsible for these. And that was beneficial to us because it taught us responsibility
Sure.
without even realizing it, And when I got up to about, my father died when I was 11, but I got up to about 7 years old, I guess, 6 or 7, my job became of getting the cows in the barn in preparation to milk them.
To milk them.
And everything was, of course, done by hand. We had no milkers or that type thing. And I would have to go, we turned the cows out in the summertime, and we had, something like 60 acres of farm, which was pretty good size back in those days.
Huge.
And we had pastures up on top of the hill, and as I've said many times, in West Virginia, you're either going up or going down. You can't find much flat land.
Right.
But the cows would go up on top of the hill, and that's where they pastured. So you'd have to go get the cows and bring them in or drive them in. And we always had a collie dog that we had trained. Somebody trained it. I didn't train it, but somebody in the family did. And we'd use the collie dog to help us round the cows up and bring them into the barn. And I've always been amazed at the fact that once you put a cow in this particular spot, and you do that a few times, then that is their spot. And every time they come to the barn, they don't go in anybody else's spot. They go to theirs.
They know their spot.
Yeah, they go to their particular spot. But that's where they're fed.
Sure.
And so they would come in. We had stanchions, we called them,
Okay.
where we'd hook them in. They couldn't get away. And then, of course, you would have to wash the sack of the cow down to eliminate any dirt or whatever.
Bacteria.
And so that was part of the job. And water was a problem in that we had to carry the water to do whatever we were going to do. We had a well that we had hand dug
Wow.
to have water in it, and then of course you had a crank the water up in a container, and that's what you would use for water. We had a couple places on the farm that were what we called full-time springs. They ran year-round, and the family or somebody in the family would build some sort of a container around that to catch the water, and that's where the cows and the horses and sheep and all the other stuff would go drink their water. And for the house, there was one wet weather spring up on top or up on the side of a hill, and we dug a line, and back in those days it had to be 2 feet deep.
Okay.
Because winters were very severe.
Freeze.
Yeah, and keep it from freezing. And it would gravity feed itself. Didn't have any pumps or that type thing to pump it in. So it would gravity feed down to the house, and that's where we got our house water.
Wow.
You know. And so it was hard work, but it was just normal because we weren't the only people who had to do it. Everybody had to do that kind of work.
Well, and I assume you had an outhouse.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, an outhouse, yeah.
An outhouse, which was normal, and
That's
I
right.
bet that was a little chilly in the wintertime.
In wintertime, you did not tarry long.
Do not delay.
Right. It's kind of an odd thing to talk about, but I can very well remember I was probably 6 or 7 years old when Work Projects Administration, we called it WPA.
Okay.
Everybody said WPA. When they came along, and they would build an outhouse for families.
Okay.
And ours was a single outhouse until that came along. And then when they came, and they did all the work, furnished all the material, everything. It was a government project.
Sure.
They built one that was double. So 2 people could go at the same time.
Which was pretty deluxe. I
It
mean,
was
that's-
deluxe at that time, you know.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, that's right.
That's and your mother must have been an incredible lady, a strong lady to be able to raise after you lost your dad, to be able to raise the family. She must have been an amazing woman.
She was. And we had, I think, a different outlook or maybe respect for moms back in those days than we do today. I don't know why that changed. I have no idea. But Mom was, even though she may have not been the head of the house, Dad was the head of the house as long as he lived, but as far as the house itself is concerned, that was Mom's temple.
Territory, yeah.
Absolutely. Dad took care of everything out of the house, but Mom took care of the house. She was the boss of the house. And we never questioned When Mom said to do something, we knew that's what we had to do. Never questioned. Said, no, I don't want to do that. You didn't do that. You just did it because that's the way you were
Sure.
raised and trained. You know, didn't question it at all.
A little different these days.
Yes, indeed.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit.
And then you had to walk quite a long ways to go to school,
Yes.
didn't you? The nearest school was
About a mile away.
okay.
Yeah.
And you walked basically.
Yeah, there were no school buses and transportation. Families didn't have cars to drive you to school. They probably wouldn't have done it if they had to have cars.
Right.
That your job is to go
Get
to
to
school and you get there. Yeah. But regardless of the weather, you went to school. Period. It was just something
There
that
were no snow days.
no snow days. You just knew you had to go to school. Well, and one boy, Leonard Brown, and another boy by the name of Everett Rudy, they lived a little farther away from the school than I did.
Okay.
And Everett was the farthest away from us.
Okay.
He would be probably a good mile and a half to the school, maybe even a mile and 3/4. But Everett would start walking to school, and then as he would come along, Leonard and his brothers would join, and then he would come along our house, and there was a Schaefer lived across the road from us, so the Schaefers would join us, and we'd all just walk to school together, you know. And you'd see 8 or 10 boys all walking to school at the same time. Yeah. And the same thing when you got out of school.
Yeah.
You'd walk back and they'd drop off at their individual houses. And
How many people were in the school approximately?
well, when I first started, we started in a little one-room grade school.
Okay.
And probably if there were 20 of us in there, I'd be surprised. I remember we sit in chairs around the room.
And that was multiple grades, so that would have been first
That's
grade,
right.
second grade. Okay.
Yes, yeah. And didn't have any desk. You just had a chair. No individual desk for anybody. Then it got to be where they realized they were going to have a bigger school, so they just built a 2-room school. And they put the first 4 grades in one room, and then the last 4 grades in the next room. So the teacher that I had in the first old school. Miss Morgan was the only teacher I ever had all the way through elementary school.
Wow.
And she never married. That was just her life.
Sure.
And so when we got the 2-room school done, she got a promotion that sent her to the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade room. And previously she'd been in 1, 2, 3, and 4th.
Okay.
Well, that so happened at the same time I was graduating 4th grade.
Okay.
So when she went to the other room, I got to go with her or in that
Gotcha.
same room, simply because I'd finished the 4th grade. Now I'm on to the 5th grade.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's
So I had her all 8th
that's
grade.
wonderful. That doesn't happen anymore either.
No, absolutely doesn't.
And so as you grew up, you eventually went to work. At that time, Roosevelt, of course, was in office, and he had what was called the New Deal.
Yes, right.
Which was a program to put Americans to work and to
Yes.
rebuild infrastructure and things like that. And so you went to work as part of one of those programs.
Yes.
And that was called the
Civilian Conservation Corps.
CCC, Civilian
CCC,
Conservation
yeah.
Corps.
We just called it the 3 Cs.
Okay,
For-
3 Cs.
Yeah, yeah.
And so how old were you at this point when you...
I was 16.
Okay. So
You couldn't go until you were 16 years old.
Okay.
The thing that's always kind of amazed me is I couldn't go in the military at 16 or 17 without a parent's permission. But you could go to the CCCs at 16 without a parent
Interesting. And it was sort of like the military,
It
wasn't it?
was. It had a little military background
Because you had military people involved. And...
Yeah, the camps were run by Army people.
Okay.
We had what we called a commanding officer, and usually it was a second lieutenant.
Okay.
All we knew him as, we didn't know ranks or grades, but all we knew he was an officer.
Sure.
And they had mess sergeant who ran the food service, and a sergeant that ran the other than food service,
Sure.
and then we had some Army clerks that were active duty Army people, and they did all the office type work, typing and administrative stuff. But when you would work off the camp area, you were actually working for a civilian
Okay.
who was specialized in whatever you were doing. If you were building a bridge, then you had somebody in the civilian life that knew how to do that. So they would supervise you off the grounds of the camp. When we were in our first camp, I thought I would go. I had a brother, my brother Gerald went first, and I thought I would go to the same camp he was in, which was about 60 miles away.
Okay.
Because as far as I knew, that was the only camp we had.
Okay.
I'm not even sure he knew there was other camps. But I thought I would go to the same one, but I learned later, many years later, we had about 29 of those camps in West Virginia.
In West Virginia. Wow.
Yeah. So when I went in at 16, they sent me to a different city.
Okay.
And our job, back up, his job, he was in a forestry area where they were cutting timbers to use for bridges and structures.
Sure.
Yeah. They sent us to another city where our job primarily was parks. Building pathways in parks, building outbuildings for storage or whatever, and to build concrete walls around cliffs.
Interesting.
So that people could go out on the cliff and look down into the valley without the danger of falling off of the cliff. So we did that, and we were there for a couple months, and then they loaded the whole group of us. There were about 265 of us in that camp, and they were from New York, New Jersey, Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, just a mixture of boys. The oldest probably was 25.
Okay.
We had a couple individuals from West Virginia that were in their 20s at least, and they loaded us aboard a train and shipped us all the way to Montana because they had a project there that they needed people to work at. And they were building fences, barbed wire fences, and they called it jack fence.
Jack fence.
Yeah, I don't know where that comes from. I have no idea. But they were building fences around government reservations. The government owned the property, but cattle people and sheep people would lease that land, and they would, put their herds on that land. So they were building fences around those areas so that the cow people would be one place and the sheep people would be another place. They didn't intermingle.
Sure, makes sense.
And the jack fence was a fence that I'd never seen before and haven't seen it since. But we'd have to go up in the Rocky Mountains and cut the posts out of pine trees. And we'd take a crew. We had a crew that was their job. Cut the timber and prepare it to be brought in, and they'd have to take all the bark off of the tree because bark rots.
Sure.
They'd peel all the bark off, and then they would put these posts in boiling creosote.
Boiling what?
Creosote.
Okay.
So that it would seep into the posts, make it last longer. Pine's a soft wood.
Sort of like pressure treating it or something.
Yeah.
Just almost. Wow.
Almost like that. And they would put it in this boiling creosote for so long. And that was, I don't know how long, because that wasn't part of my job.
Sure.
But it boiled so long, and then they would take it out and stack it. And of course, then they would transport those posts to the area that they were fencing in.
Yeah.
So my first job was just cutting trees.
Okay.
And we had an individual who was a forester. He knew forestry. He knew everything about what we were trying to do. And so we were cutting trees. Then I got a break. They made me a truck driver. So I was a crew truck driver. I would load the crew aboard, and 16 or 18 individuals, drive them to the campsite or the work site. And then my job, of course, was to take care of the details other than cutting trees.
Yeah, understood.
Make the coffee? I had to make coffee.
Hey, that's okay. That's okay, though. It's all right.
Yeah. and then I got another promotion, if you could call it that. They gave me a truck flatbed to haul the posts from where they'd been creosoted to the job site.
Okay.
And I can remember we were in a place called Whitehall, Montana. We're hauling the posts to Missoula, Montana. And you had to cross the divide, Continental Divide, twice. You had to go up, you get to Butte, and then you had to turn and go west again and back over the divide to the job site. And one side of going up the divide would be this way, back and forth, just curving.
Yeah.
But the other side was straight, but it had plateaus.
Wow.
So you wouldn't have a straight hill, from the top of the divide all the way to the valley. You'd go down so far and level off, and then you go down again, level off, and it was an interesting.
It's good you grew up in the mountains, in West Virginia, so you were prepared for that.
That's right. Exactly.
And that was probably by far the furthest you had ever traveled from.
Oh, I didn't think I'd ever get back home.
And there wasn't much in Montana. Now there's not much. I'm sure there wasn't much.
No, very little.
So you did that. How long did you work for the CCC approximately?
I was there. I went in at 16, and I was just short of 17.
17.
When Pearl Harbor happened.
Wow. Okay.
On December the 7th, of course.
1940.
And the next day after Pearl Harbor, we knew nothing about anything. We had no radios.
So you were in Montana when that happened.
And we had no communications, no newspapers or magazines or anything to tell us what was going on in the world.
Yeah.
We didn't know. So the officers or the officer in charge and the staff called us out the morning after Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
And got us in some formation and told us that America was going to war, the CCCs were going to be discontinued, and that if you were over 18 years of age, you could go right then and enlist into the Army.
Straight into the Army.
Yeah. But if you're under 18, then you couldn't, because you had to have a parent consent. And I knew my mother was not going to give me any parent consent, and I didn't have any way of getting it anyway. I would have had to write a letter. She would have had to write a letter back. By that time, it's too late.
Right.
So I came home. They put me on a train, gave me a ticket, and sent me back to West Virginia.
Okay.
But I did want to go. My plan was, when I got home, these individuals went straight into the Army. A great number of them did.
Yeah.
So I wanted to be a part of
that.
Defending America.
Sure.
And my plan was, of course, to come home and join the Marine Corps. I've been asked many, many times, why did I select the Marine Corps? I knew nothing about any branch of the service. I guess maybe I knew we had a Navy, and maybe I knew we had a Army, but I'm not quite sure we ever knew about the Marine Corps at all, except that we had one individual during the Depression years, about mid-30s. He enlisted in the Marine Corps.
Okay.
And he was just one of the people living in the community, no
Okay.
friend of mine or whatever. But at that time, they got to come home one time a year. They
Okay.
give them what was known as a 30-day furlough, and they'd get home one time a year. And if they lived close, if they were stationed close, they could hitchhike home
Okay.
and hitchhike back. But they had to be, they'd have to leave on Friday, be back on Sunday evening. You could do whatever your weekend was. But he had to wear his dress blues, this individual. And he always looked very neat and sharp, And so I think that enticed me to want to be a Marine. My two brothers, one next to me and then the next one up, had both been drafted in early 1942.
Okay.
And one of them, particularly the one next to me, he got to come home pretty often. He could hitchhike on Friday evening home and then hitchhike back on Sunday. And he had to wear his Army uniform. That's all they had.
Yeah.
They took their clothes away from them, the civilian clothes. And I didn't like the uniform at all. It looked horrible. So the Marine Corps looked much better. So I think that's why I wanted to be a Marine.
That's amazing. All the little things that happened for you to get where
Yeah,
on that island at that point in time is
isn't that amazing? It is.
unbelievable.
Yeah.
Okay, so you came home, you wanted to join the Marine Corps, but they had the height requirement at that time.
That's right. Yeah.
5'8" was the height requirement, and you were only 5'6" tall.
Correct.
Wow. So you could not join the Marine Corps. So what did you do then? You just
I
stayed
went back
up?
to the farm.
Okay.
Yeah. When they told me, when I handed in my paper, there was only one sheet. And basically what they were looking for on that sheet was your next of kin and who was to receive your $10,000 life insurance in the event you got killed while serving. And so it was just one sheet. And when I tried to give him my sheet, he didn't even look at it, really. He just looked at me, and I'm not the only one. He turned down a whole
Did he really?
number of people because we were in a community where we had a number of Italian residents, people
Okay.
from, that were Italian descent, and most of them were short people. They weren't
Interesting.
really tall people. So I'm sure he turned down a whole number of
Interesting.
short people. And then when the height requirement was lowered in 43, I went in November after my 18th birthday.
Wow. Okay.
Because now I didn't need mom's consent.
Sure.
I could go on my own, And in early 43, when they took the height requirement down, that Marine recruiter looked me up, and I'm sure he did other people too, because he still had the paper that we turned into him.
So he came after you. He seeked you out.
Yeah,
Wow.
and asked me he came to the farm and 7 miles out, and said, "Do you still want to go in the Marine Corps?" And I said yes. So okay.
My dad was a Marine. He passed away in 2009, but he served in Korea and Vietnam.
Oh yeah.
And Marines, every step of the way in any war in our nation's history, including today, always seem to draw the toughest assignments.
That's true.
Always.
Yes.
And you're right. They look the sharpest, most disciplined, little crazy, maybe, some of them that I met. You know, my dad was a little bit, based on how he kept me in line growing up.
Yes.
But no, the Marines are the best of the best. So for whatever reason, I think you ended up in the right place.
I think so too.
However it happened. So you finally joined the Marine Corps, which you had always wanted to do. And I believe they shipped you out west.
Yes.
For
at that time, there were so many people. Of course, the East Coast at that time was more heavily populated than the West Coast.
Makes sense.
So many people on the East Coast wanted to get in, particularly volunteering for the Marine Corps, that we only had one place to train them. The Army had a number of places they could train, but we only had one place. So Parris Island was just getting so many people, they didn't have housing for them. And they started forming troop trains, they called them.
Okay.
That it was just a train with seats in it, wooden slatted seats, period.
Wow.
Most uncomfortable thing you can possibly sit on.
I can imagine.
No cushions.
I can imagine.
But they started those down in the southern part of the country.
Okay.
And they would come up through every state, like Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and they'd pick up so many in that particular community.
Gotcha.
There were 6 of us, West Virginians,
Okay.
that when we went to what they called the induction station,
Okay.
and you said you wanted to be a Marine, well, they separated you in groups.
Okay.
So 6 of us were selected to go to San Diego, California for our boot camp because Parris Island just couldn't handle everybody. And they put us on a bus and sent us from Clarksburg, West Virginia, that was the induction station at that time, to Charleston.
Okay.
And we were there overnight. And then the next day we got on the train and headed for California. And it took 5 days.
5 days.
5 days on that train to get to California.
And you probably picked guys up along the way.
Did, every state, yeah. And we get to Chicago, we had to change trains because there was no joining of the western trains with the eastern trains. And of course, war equipment was being produced rapidly, trucks and armor of all kinds. So if there was a freight train coming through carrying war material, then the passenger train had to get off and wait until the freight train went through. So that was one of the reasons why it really took 5 days, because we would get off and sit there for a long time, and those freight trains would be, 4 or 5 miles long.
Interesting. And so at that point, the general feeling in the United States, because of Pearl Harbor, everybody was angry.
Exactly.
With the Japanese.
Yes.
Right. And so did you know at that point that you would most likely be going to fight in the Pacific? Did you have any idea?
No idea.
Okay.
No, and I think the most of us thought this way because here again, communications were very limited.
Understood.
But I know I personally felt that when I joined, I would be joining everybody else to protect America, not to go to the South Pacific to fight a war. I'd never heard of the South Pacific.
Understood.
And it wasn't until we got in boot camp that then they began educating us.
Sure.
And fortunately, we had 3 drill instructors, and 2 of those drill instructors had already been overseas and had some combat experience. And they brought them back then to teach we new recruits a little bit about combat.
So like at Guadalcanal or something like
Yeah.
that, they had fought. Wow.
Yeah.
What valuable experience that
It was.
Wow.
Because otherwise, the individual teaching us wouldn't have had any knowledge of combat.
Wow.
So they couldn't tell us much. And so that was valuable. It really was.
And so when you arrived at boot camp, that was, of course, because you had been in the CCC, that probably prepared you
It did.
for military life.
Yeah,
A little bit. You were
Yeah.
probably in pretty good shape.
I was.
Good condition.
Yeah.
And so I imagine based on, my dad was a drill instructor for a while, so I can imagine how but they woke you up, right?
That's right.
Yelled at you a little bit and
Yep.
enforced
Yeah.
discipline and all those sorts of things.
But they had to change your whole thinking process because, we had been taught over and over and over during our growing up period that you didn't kill.
Right.
That's an absolute no-no.
Thou shalt not kill.
Now we're having to be trained. If we're going to win this war, we have got to be the aggressor. We've got to be the guy that takes the other guy out. And that is a complete change of philosophy. So it was a big change in your life. Now you're thinking altogether thoughts you'd never had in your life. And the only way you're going to survive is to be trained how to survive. And that's why those two individuals that had combat were so valuable, because they could talk to us in a language we had never heard before.
Understood.
Yeah.
Were you raised as a child? Were you raised fairly religious?
No.
Okay.
No, we weren't. We didn't have a church in the community.
Okay.
The communities were all around us. We had lots of communities, places like Grady Creek, Grassy Run, Lower
Sure.
Levels, and most of those communities had a church. Quiet Dell, for whatever reason, nobody ever started a church there.
Huh.
So and it was a mile or 2 miles or 3 miles to the next community. So most people didn't travel that far,
Right.
but you had to walk
Right.
back and forth, So they didn't go to church. I'd never been in church. My mother had a Bible. Since there were no birth records anywhere, she kept all the records of all the births and deaths and marriages and everything in this one big Bible.
Interesting.
But that was the only record you had.
Interesting.
And it was about 16 by 18 book, and she kept it in a special place, and we were absolutely forbidden to even touch it, because that was the only record we had that we even existed. And if that thing had burned, who would have ever known, So when I got ready to go in the Marine Corps, one of the first things they asked me is, "Where's your birth certificate?" I didn't have any. None of us had a birth certificate, because you had to have a doctor to have a birth certificate. And we never had a doctor, so we had no birth certificate. The only record we had was in that Bible. See?
Wow.
So when they asked me for the birth certificate, and I said, "I don't have a birth certificate." They said, "Well, you got to have a birth certificate, or you can't go, you can't be accepted." And so, but they said there is such a thing as a delayed birth certificate. If you can get your mother and 2 witnesses that know that you were born and will sign this document certifying they were present at the time of your birth, we can get you a delayed birth certificate through the health department.
Interesting.
So I had to go to the courthouse and get a paper and take it home. And of course, Mom signed it because of the mother.
Right.
And then Miss Myrtle signed it as
Yes.
she was present. And my sister signed it because she was present.
Interesting.
So those 3 pieces, I took it. We sent it to the health department in Charleston, and they sent me back a delayed birth certificate.
Very interesting. And you needed that to get into the...
Yeah.
Wow.
I couldn't have gotten the Marine Corps if I hadn't been able to get that.
Wow. So, nonetheless, even... And I noticed just from breakfast that, you said grace. And so, it seems that as life has progressed, you've become, more religious.
Yes.
And I imagine probably some of that had to do with your experiences in the war.
Well, it did, but one of the principal encouragers and examples that I had in my life, I was fortunate enough to marry a Christian girl. She was born and raised in the church.
Okay.
I mean, her mother and father were very dedicated to the church, and from the time she was a little girl, they took her to church. She was raised that way. So she had an outlook about life that I had never even experienced or knew nothing about. Yet she never put any pressure on me. You know, never said, you know, if you don't go to church, I'm not going to stay with you, or any of that kind of stuff. But the way she acted and reacted and dealt with other people and philosophy that she had certainly had an impact on my thinking.
Understood.
Yet I would not go to church. I don't know whether it was the Marine Corps training or just the lack of knowledge, I'm not sure. But I didn't think I needed God.
Interesting.
I thought I was self-sufficient. I could do whatever I wanted to do on my own. I didn't need any help. You know. I had two daughters, and when they got up to old enough to think and talk and harass, both of them, they were raised in the church. My wife, from the time they were little girls, babies, she took them to church. Yeah. So they grew up like she did. And they would continue to encourage me to go to church with them. I just kept refusing until 1962, and that's when my life changed, and I went in a totally different direction than I'd ever known in my life, doing things I never dreamed I would ever be doing, and participating with people that I previously would not have had anything to do with. I just wouldn't. But it changed for the good. I was never a bad drinker. I drank too much. But I was never to the point that I didn't know what I was doing, or I'm sure there were times I drove home I shouldn't have been on the road, you know, but my life completely changed to where that desire went away. I was smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, you know, and participating in functions that I probably shouldn't have been there.
Sure.
You know? But all that changed, and I took on new life. And it's been such a thrill and such a blessing to be able to have that assurance that you're trying to do the right thing in life.
Absolutely.
And when you do something for somebody else, there is a reward that you get out of that you can't get from any other source. Absolutely.
Well, and it's interesting too, because at that point in your life, you know, you may not have wanted God at that point, but He wanted you.
That's right. Exactly.
You know,
right.
because I know from talking to you in the past, and there's many, many times that you probably shouldn't have made it, but
That's
you
right.
did. And so He wanted you, and He knew, you know, what was inside of you, and just a matter of time, you know, before you realized it. And what was your wife's name?
Ruby.
Ruby. And you met her, if I'm not mistaken, when you came back home, before you joined the Marine Corps, you became a taxi driver for
Yes.
a period of time.
Yes.
And you met her as part of that.
Yes. Yeah. She took my taxi a couple times, and that started the romance. You know, the first time I took her home, she was working for a parts house, auto parts house, and they were doing an inventory of all the parts. And back in those days, you had to do it meticulously, you know, with a pencil and a paper. Now you do it computer-wise and altogether different. But she had to work over because they had a deadline, that they had to have that report in, or wherever they were giving it to. And I took her home the first time. She was in the back seat, that was just normal.
Right.
People would take a cab, they stood in the back seat.
Understood.
And so then a few days later, she had to work over again, and the buses were already going. And after 6 o'clock, there were no buses. And so I took her home second time. I brazen enough to ask her to sit up front with me so we could talk.
Smart move, by the way.
That started it. Yeah.
Smart
So
move.
I asked her for a date, and but I had to go to the house. Absolutely.
Sure.
And we couldn't go anywhere. Her daddy would not
That's
let her
the
go.
way it happened.
That's right. Yeah. And we had a curfew, 9 o'clock.
Wow. That
You're
was
out of here. Can't stay after 9.
Oh wow. And so you were able to date for about how long before you went off to boot camp?
About, let's see, probably 3 months, right at 3 months.
Well, that was enough time to get to know each other and develop a relationship. And so you obviously wrote back and forth probably the whole time through boot camp and the whole time.
Yes, absolutely.
Overseas. And was she older than you or younger than you?
She's 1 year younger.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
She was born 24 and I was born 23.
Okay. Youngster. She was a youngster. So back to boot camp. Boot camp at that point was maybe
13 weeks.
13 weeks. Okay. So you graduated boot camp. Oh, tell this. Either you told me the story or I read this story, but there was a time, I think this was at boot camp, there was a time where when you were sleeping, one of your buddies tied your...
Yeah.
Tell that story if you could. I think it's a great story.
Well, when we first got there were so many people coming in that the Marine Corps couldn't get shoes for everybody. Yeah. And...
or boots. Or,
yeah. We called them half high boots or half high shoes, but they just came to the ankle. Just above the ankle.
Okay.
Now, low-cut shoes were below the ankle.
Okay.
But for the first several weeks, we had to wear the shoes that we brought from home, that we wore from home.
Interesting. Okay.
And I remember we were doing a lot of marching because we were conditioning.
Sure.
Trying to get, and all I had on was a low-cut pair of store-bought shoes. And all of a sudden, the ball of the shoe, where your ball of your foot is, I got holes in them. Now my feet or my socks or my sole of my shoes. So I find some cardboard, and I put cardboard in my shoes so that my feet wouldn't be on the blacktop. Well, we called it macadam back in those days, not blacktop.
Okay, macadam.
And it was rough. It was rough stuff because it wasn't smooth like this table. So, but they finally got us these shoes that were above the ankle, and they were string tied, of course. So of a morning when you got up after your shaving and showering, all that, you had to make your bunk up. Okay. You had to roll your bunk up so that just the springs would show, and you had to have your pillows on the top of the bunk, on top of the mattress, so the bunk was roll from there down, just the springs. Well, at noon, when you get after your noon meal, we had probably an hour break at noon.
Okay.
But you'd go to chow, then you come back and get a short rest before you start again at 1 o'clock. Well, you could go up you could lay on your bunk. We call it a rack, but just a metal bed with springs on it. But you couldn't roll your mattress out.
Okay, gotcha.
You had to leave that mattress rolled up all day, So I'd get up on there, and I'm in the top bunk. And a guy by the name of Williams from Tennessee is on the lower bunk.
Okay. Another Williams?
Another Williams,
okay.
yeah. So I go to sleep, and he decides to pull this trick on me. He untied my shoes and tied my shoe strings to the springs.
Oh, jeez.
So when the GI hollers, "Fall out," you've only got so many minutes, or so many seconds, to get from where you are to standing where he wants you. So you just jump out and start running. Well, I tried that, and of course, having been tied to the bunk, all I did was hang over the side of the thing.
Go ahead. So you
I'm hanging there.
You sprang up to go fall into formation.
Somebody has to come to my rescue because I'm hanging over the bunk.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So somebody has to come and untie my shoes, and of course I'm late now for the formation. I'm the guy that's in trouble.
Right.
Well, of course he and I had our difference at that.
Sure, you were not happy at that point.
Now, so that evening we're going to go back behind the hut. We lived in huts.
Yeah.
Plywood huts, but we're going to go behind the hut, and we're going to resolve this problem. Yeah. Well, we started, and the DI caught us.
Okay.
Yeah. And of course, that was a no-no.
No fighting.
You weren't supposed to do that with each other.
Right.
Yeah. So he caught us and said, "Okay, you guys want to fight? All right." And he went and got a huge pair of boxing gloves. Those great big things. They weren't little things. They were great big things. You couldn't hurt anybody with one of those if you wanted to. But he got us a set of boxing gloves and took us back out, and he said, "Okay, go at it."
Go ahead. I love that. That was how the military should be. They don't allow that anymore. That's how the military should be.
That's right. Well, I got the worst end of it. So, but we just wore ourselves out. We didn't hurt each other because those boxing gloves wouldn't let you do that. But we just wore ourselves out, and I wore out before he did. So
that's a good story. Did you mentioned that your two drill instructors that had combat experience. Did they educate you on how brutal the Japanese soldiers were? Did they educate you and prepare you?
To a degree.
Okay.
To a degree, they did. That their philosophy and our philosophy was so different, and that they were more tenacious than we were, because it is our inclination to preserve, save life, keep our lives, do everything that we can to protect our lives and the lives of those around us. Their philosophy was that if they sacrificed their life in combat, then they received some form of a reward. So that made them more tenacious than we were.
Understood.
Yeah, because whatever they do, if they die, they're going to get some sort of a reward out of it that we don't understand. Never did understand it. But they're dying for the emperor.
Yeah.
And we're fighting for freedom.
Right.
Altogether a different philosophy.
That sounds pretty familiar, to be honest with you. I was in Iraq and we were fighting over there, and it sounds that philosophy sounds pretty familiar with the 72 virgins and all the things it's a fanatical deal. And of course at that point in the war, the Japanese had more or less taken over all of Asia, and they had gone into China and raped and pillaged and done all those things. And did you guys know about any of that at that point? None of that was, because there was no media or information. Right. It was you had no way of knowing.
No.
But you knew before you went into combat that they were a brutal bunch.
Yes.
You knew that much from
and they were not going to give up.
Right.
Yeah, they told us that they will not surrender.
And how did you reconcile? You mentioned this about how your whole life you were taught the value "thou shalt not kill." You mentioned this earlier, and all of a sudden in boot camp, it's all about killing and having to take lives. How did you reconcile that in your own mind? When you stepped foot on that ship eventually to go overseas, in your mind, were you prepared to kill? Do you remember?
Yes, yeah. And I think it was the cause rather than, certainly not the desire, but it was the cause, overall cause of why we're doing this. We're not doing it for ourselves. We're doing it for a greater cause than we are, because our freedom is threatened. And if they win, our whole lives are going to change. We're not going to be the Americans that we want to be. And that gave us a purpose. You know, we've got to win, or we're going to lose everything we got.
And at that point too, the West Coast was threatened, correct?
That's right.
People
yeah.
thought at that point that an attack could happen anytime because after Pearl Harbor, it was recognized the threat of the Japanese Navy, and so people were living in fear.
That's exactly right.
And so the mentality was probably, as you just said, that we're going to go defend our country, and we're going to do whatever has to be done to protect the United States.
Yeah, yeah.
And so after boot camp, you went to Southern California to do some training, some further, was it infantry training?
Yeah, infantry training.
Infantry training. And that's where I believe you worked with tanks and learned.
Yeah, we first, the first training that we got out of boot camp was how to work with tanks. Tanks were reasonably new, even in 1943. Europe had a whole bunch of them, but the Pacific, not many places you can use tanks in the jungle.
Makes sense.
You know, so, but we still had to have some knowledge of how do you work with a tank.
Makes sense.
And the infantry, the tanks were to support the infantry.
Makes sense.
Not vice versa.
Right.
You know, so that we did some training that way. Then once we got that knowledge, then they sent us to a regular infantry training, where we were learning now how to fight in
Combined arms.
yeah, and dig foxholes and
Sure.
all that sort of stuff to protect yourself.
And I remember there was a story about you had a road march. It was shortly before you deployed, I believe, and you had a very high fever.
Yes.
Very high fever, but you didn't go to sick call.
No, growing up, I had what doctors called at least, strep throat.
Okay.
And there were a couple times my mother took me to doctor because my throat would swell up. I couldn't talk, couldn't swallow, and so they would give something you'd swab your throat with iodine and all.
Yeah.
Terrible thing. But when I got up that particular morning, I knew I had a temperature and my throat was real sore and swollen. And but I'm going to go with my outfit. I'm not going to go to sick bay. I'm a Marine, you know, that sort of philosophy. So we were going on a 10-mile hike that day.
Wow.
And we'd have a break every hour, 10-minute smoke break, they called it, you know. So we'd walk for 50 minutes, rest for 10, now another 50 minutes. Well, I was a smoker back in those days, of course, but I couldn't even smoke.
Wow.
Because I was just too sick. And at noon, when we stopped for chow, that's when I passed out.
Wow.
And of course, the corpsman came and looked at me and took my temperature, and I had 105.
Jesus.
So they called the ambulance, or had the ambulance come in and pick me up and take me back to the base hospital. And I'd never heard of it, and certainly haven't had that experience since, and don't want it. But because of my temperature was up so high, they put some ice around me. That was a strange feeling, you know.
I can
to be
imagine.
lying naked in bed with ice around you. Now, they didn't cover me, they just put it down the side of me, you know, to start cooling my body down.
Wow.
And finally, of course, my temperature started dropping, and and they'd given me medication. A day or two later, the doctor came in, Navy doctor, and said, we're going to take your tonsils out. And I got a visit from one of the guys in my outfit that came to see me in the hospital, and it was a base hospital. So, he told me when he came to visit that they were going to ship out,
Wow.
that they'd got notice they're going to ship out, board ship and head out. And so when the doctor came in next time, I said, I got to get out of here. My outfit's shipping out, and I want to go with them. I'm going to go with them. He said, I can't discharge you, because you're not well. You know? And I said, well, I'm going to go anyhow. And I would have, I'd have gone AWOL. But he said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll let you go. But he said, I'm going to give you a piece of paper. And when you get aboard ship, they'll have a medical unit there. And you give them this piece of paper, and they can take your tonsils out aboard ship. So he gave me the paper, and I went about my business and got my pack and got every stuff ready and boarded ship with everybody else. I don't know whatever happened to that piece of paper, but I still got my tonsils.
Miraculously, the piece of paper just got lost.
Yeah, somebody got it. I don't know.
Oh my gosh, what a great story. That is.
I didn't want my tonsils. I didn't want to lose my tonsils.
Oh my gosh. Well, but what that showed a couple things, you know, as you're building the person that you know, ended up becoming. This is just yet another step in the way, because it showed your determination, your willingness to be with your men, you know, and it was just, to me, it was just a great example of your dedication, you know, at an early age. Before you knew any better, you were just naturally a dedicated person. And so you shipped out, and I'm not sure if I pronounce this right, on the MS Weltevreden? Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Weltevreden.
Yeah.
MS Weltevreden on December 3rd, 1943. You set sail. And then you went from there to New Caledonia.
Correct.
First. Were there any problems along the way? Any torpedo attacks or anything like that?
No, but there were a lot of, you know, we could tell you weren't going in a straight line.
Right. You were zigzagging.
Yeah, we were zigzagging. And we had a lot of escorts. There were
Destroyer.
I mean, ours wasn't the only ship in that group. There were a bunch of ships. And so we were zigzagging.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But New Caledonia, it was what they called a replacement center. And my outfit wasn't the only Marines there. There were other Marines shipped from other outfits.
So everybody would be consolidated there.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they were sending them then out to the various Marine units to replace or fill in the vacancies that they had. And every morning you had to have roll call.
Okay.
You know, they had a roster of everybody that was in the camp, and they had different areas, and they would make a roll call. They just say your last name and ho, you know, that type of thing. They didn't know whether you were there or not.
Right.
John over here could have answered for you, and they would have known any difference, you know. But and that happened. We been there several days, and there were natives, New Caledonia natives, brown, little, really skinny guys as far as I was concerned. But they had a lot of coconut trees, and those natives could put a rope around their feet. They went on, they were barefoot. They didn't have any shoes. And they could put a rope around their feet and lock it onto a tree and just go up a coconut tree like, you know, woo, 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 woo,
That's
woo.
crazy.
I mean, it was amazing.
Yeah.
And I was really amazed at the speed that they could go and come back the same way, you know. So three of us, we decided we're going to goof off this particular morning.
Yeah.
We weren't doing anything all day long.
That's what Marines do, by the way.
That's right.
If we're not fighting, we got to find something to do. So
Something to do. And they really didn't have duties. Some of them had duties, but everybody didn't have any duty, and you just do nothing all day. So we decided we're going to go down to the ocean. And I had seen the ocean on the West Coast at Los Angeles,
Okay.
but just the edge of it.
That was it.
I rode a roller coaster right on the edge of
Okay.
the ocean in Los Angeles. That was the only time I ever saw the ocean. So we're going to go down to see the ocean. And we went through the jungle and got to the ocean front. And when we got down there was a kind of a leeway back in here where the ocean would wash back in, but it wouldn't come back out again. It just kept going this way. And the water was stagnated, really.
Yeah.
And right on the other side of that was a little island, and it had big, tall coconut trees on it. And so we were in the jungle area, and that little island was pretty well cleared.
Okay.
So we decided to go from here to there, and we just swam across this little
Channel.
distance between the islands, and got over there, and none of us had ever seen a coconut tree or a coconut before off of a tree. So this big old coconut hanging up here. And they said, I'm the littlest guy in the group. Yeah. Why don't you come up and get that coconut? Well, we didn't have any rope. So, but we were wearing our belt around we had short swim trunks on, but we had taken our belt, our web belt, put around. So either they or I decided, well, I'll use the web belt, hook it and put it on my feet. I can do that. If he can do it, I can do it. So I do. I put that thing on my feet and I start going up that coconut tree, And I got my arms around it, of course. I'm bare-bodied from waist up.
Yep.
And all I had was trunks on, my lower body. And so I'm climbing this tree. Well, I lose my belt. My belt falls off. Well, there ain't no way you're going to put that belt back on your feet hanging on a coconut tree. So they kept yelling at the bottom, keep going, you guys. Well, I thought you could pick a coconut just like you would pick an apple. Just take a hold of it and pull it off. We didn't know. I get up there and I can reach the coconut. I got one arm around the tree and I'm up here trying to pull this coconut off, and it wouldn't come. So they're down there yelling at me, pull harder or twist it. I twisted the thing a couple of times, and it'd just go around and come right back to the same spot it was. So they kept yelling, "Well, you got to get up higher. Go a little higher." So okay, so I make one more big lunge.
And how high are you now, roughly?
I'm 25.
Oh my gosh.
30 feet in the air.
Okay.
I'm way up there.
Oh, jeez.
And so I give one more lunge, and of course my arms are now so tired, and my feet are hurting, but I'm barefoot trying to climb the rough, bark. And so I get to the top, and so I'm going to reach the coconut and jerk on it. Well, I lost my balance. I've lost my grip. And down that coconut tree I came. And instinct takes over. I lack onto the coconut tree to try to keep myself from falling. And I just peel all the hide off of my arms, my hands, my heels. I had holes in my heels, great big holes, I just dug the skin out. And even peeled my nose, my chin, and I hit the ground and knocked every bit of air out of me that I had. They really thought I was gone. And of course, they got frightened about the whole thing. So One of them got one arm, one in the other, and hung me over their shoulders, and we went back across that
Through the
water, and it was very salty. It was just almost covered with salt water, you know. Probably the best thing they could have done was the minute they hit that. I came alive when they hit that water.
I bet you did. Stung like you wouldn't believe.
Absolutely, and my whole body,
Wow.
you know. And so they got me back to first aid, back to the first aid corpsman. And when they took me in the office, they're still carrying me, so kind of dragging me, but they're getting me in. And he said, put him in that bed in the back. They had a little hut, and they had a little back room where they had two little beds back there, bunks. He said, put him in one of those bunks. And of course, they jerked my swim trunks off, and he takes an old black salve. I had no idea what it was. With a tongue compressor, and he starts smearing my body.
Wow.
And he just covers my body with that black salve. And when I'm out of it, really. When I come to, next morning, I think it was, but it was daylight anyway. I come to, I'm now scabbed over. I can't hardly move.
Wow.
And he kept me there for 3 days. And one of those guys that was with me, when they'd call my name.
In the roll call?
Yeah, I'd go, no. So I never got missed.
You never missed formation.
That's exactly right.
Oh.
But I carried those scars for a long time. They weren't deep; they were just peeled the hide off.
And you were leaving short. You were only in New Caledonia for a few weeks.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow. So you didn't have very long to recover.
That's true.
And then you.
And we got aboard another ship, of course, and they shipped us to Guadalcanal. But when we were aboard ship, we didn't have anything to do.
Yeah.
You know, and I could. One of the things I think really helped me as much as anything else, we could go up on the top deck, and what we called sunbathe.
Yeah.
You just stretch out on the top deck and
Yep.
lay in the sun.
Yep.
And I did that. Yeah.
Probably the salt water, the salve, and then the sun.
That's right. Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so you went to Guadalcanal at that point, which now you thought maybe you were going to Bougainville.
We were scheduled to go to Bougainville.
Bougainville.
Yeah. They were still fighting on Bougainville.
Right.
In December, and then at the end of December, or middle to the end of December, they had overcome the Japanese enough that the Marines could call the island secure.
Okay.
And the Army came in then and replaced them, and they brought them out.
And so the 3rd Division came back to Guadalcanal
Yeah.
at that point. So that's where you joined them
Right.
as a replacement. So that's where you were officially assigned to the 3rd Division.
Yes.
At that point.
That's right.
Or probably you were assigned to New Caledonia, and then you had joined them in Guadalcanal at that point. And then you were assigned to the 21st Regiment, 1st Battalion, Company C.
Correct.
Company C.
Yeah.
And so on Guadalcanal, which was a secure island, there were still remnants of Japanese on the island.
That's right.
That
Yeah.
had hidden, or had hidden, and so they would come out occasionally. And so you were actually running combat patrols occasionally.
Well, some of them were. I never got sent
Okay.
on a combat.
But your unit was.
Yeah.
Your unit was.
Yeah. Somebody would report that they had seen some Japanese, and they'd
Sure.
form a patrol and go out and search them out. Yeah.
And the Japanese, as we all know, would hide in caves, and they would do anything they could to kill
That's right.
one more American before
That's-
they died, or
Yeah.
whatever the case may be. So you were on Guadalcanal for how long?
Until June.
Till
of
June.
44.
Okay, till June of 44. And you were on Guadalcanal. You were first a BAR man,
Yes.
right? You were initially assigned as a BAR man, which is a Browning automatic rifle. And then you did that for a little while, and then they converted you into a special weapons
Yeah.
expert. Or what was the technical word?
It was called a Special Weapons Unit.
Okay.
But it was Demolition Flamethrower Group.
Okay.
They formed these six persons in the group with a sergeant in charge and a gunnery sergeant in charge of all the groups.
Gotcha. Okay.
So we had one gunnery sergeant that was in charge of 2 or 3 of the groups.
So you were responsible for demolitions, explosives, obviously the flamethrower.
Yeah.
Which, and so is that the point on Guadalcanal where you were assigned to be a flamethrower officially?
Yeah, right. We got the flamethrowers in. I remember they came in great big wooden boxes. And I say big, they were probably 4 or 5 feet tall.
Wow. Okay.
And
Crates.
probably 3 or 4 feet in diameter. But they were crated boxes. And when we got them, we didn't know what was in there. And when we broke all the wood away from the flamethrower, we see now the flamethrower the first time. We'd never seen one.
Wow.
Didn't know what it was, really.
Were the flamethrowers sent to the Pacific first? Was this the first time flamethrowers had ever been used by the U.S. before, or did they go to Europe? I'd never heard of them in Europe. So
I never either.
I haven't heard of them.
I can't answer that.
Okay.
I don't think so. I don't think they used them much in Europe at all.
Interesting. I've never heard of it, but I was just curious.
I don't know.
So these big crates show up, and you're a flamethrower, and so you unpack this.
Yeah. Unpack it, and here it is. None of us knew what the heck.
Were there any instructions?
Well, it had a manual with it,
Okay.
and the manual gave you all the parts numbers and how to take it apart, put
Okay.
it together, how much fuel it held,
Okay.
and but no information as to how to employ it in a combat situation at all.
Interesting.
And with it, when they first came in, they had a brown bag in plastic, or we didn't call it plastic back then, cellophane bag with it that had a powder in it.
Okay.
And on the bag itself, it said that this is to be mixed with gasoline, and it gave
Formula?
well, in a sense it did. It was 4.5. The tanks would hold 4.5 gallons.
Okay.
So you would put so much gasoline in this to make up a 4.5 gallon
Okay.
capacity.
Okay.
And once you put that powder in there, looking at it just in the bag, you couldn't tell it had phosphorus in it.
Okay.
But once you put it in the gasoline, then you could tell it had phosphorus in it. So it was a phosphorus powder.
Interesting.
And once you put it in the gasoline, it turned from powder to a gel.
Okay.
Not as thick as Jell-O, thinner than that,
Okay.
but it was sticky.
Okay.
It's sticky stuff. And the compressed air tank on the flamethrower, it told you had to have 1750 psi on
Okay.
that to force the fuel out.
Okay.
And so we began experimenting. We'd put the powder in a bucket, mix it all up, and we didn't have buckets that had 4.5 gallons. We only had buckets that would hold 2 gallons, So we'd mix it back and forth.
Yeah.
But eventually we'd get 4.5 gallons of stuff stirred up, and then put it in the flamethrower. And we used compressed air for the air tank.
Okay.
You could use oxygen if you didn't have compressed air.
Okay. Interesting.
But we did have compressed air. They had these big tall cylinders with compressed air. And we'd put the stuff in it. Then we would take it out and shoot it. In the front of the, they call it a wand, they call it a gun. It's the only thing that in my experience, that I could ever call a gun. You never called a rifle a gun.
Right, right.
Never made that mistake but one time. But on the front of the wand or the gun, it had a Bakelite cylinder,
Okay.
black cylinder. It was about 1.5 inches wide.
Okay.
And had 5 matches in there.
Interesting. Okay.
They were like a farmer's match kind of a thing.
Okay. Okay.
And on the front of the gun itself, it had an extra trigger. And when you pulled that trigger, it pushed a stiff piece of wire out that pushed the match through that cylinder. And when it went out, it lit. It was a phosphorus match type thing. It lit, started burning, and on the cylinder itself, it had wax. So the wax would burn for 10 seconds around each one of those.
So you would have a 10-second flame for which to deploy the fuel
Right.
through and ignite the...
Right.
Wow.
And if you pulled the trigger, it circled. It's like a pistol. When you pulled the trigger, one match would light. You pulled the trigger again, then the next match would come into play.
Yeah.
And you could just keep pulling the trigger. You could do it 5 times, and it would light every time. But we carried, after we learned how to do all this, we carried extra cylinders in our packs because you may have a lot of fuel left over, but if you don't have a match,
can't light it.
nothing. You just got fluid. So we'd carry a bunch of those in our
Unless
pack.
there was already a fire, then technically you could
Yeah,
put fuel onto the fire if
Right.
there was already, after you'd already,
yeah.
technically. Wow. So keep going. This is
Well,
super interesting.
the gunnery sergeant we had was an old China Marine, and we mixed a bunch of this stuff up and took it out to practice. We would just set up something to shoot at, and you're shooting from the hip,
Sure.
and you had one stream like a water hose you were trying to hit that particular target with it. Well, by the time you get on target and you're shooting 25, 30 yards, by the time you get on target, you've used up 4.5 gallons.
And how long would that last, the 4.5 gallons approximately, if you were consistent flame?
Probably minute and a
Wow.
half.
Okay.
Puts it out pretty fast.
Sure.
Yeah. If you just leave it open.
Sure. Sure.
So we learned not to do that because you're just wasting stuff. But by the time you got on target, this gel stuff was so sticky that if you got on it, and some of us did, got it on us, and you tried to rub it off, all you did was spread it, and the phosphorus in it would just keep burning. And some of the guys, I didn't, fortunately enough. I guess I learned from others. Some of them got it on their hands, and they had scabs on their hands where that phosphorus would burn. So the gunnery sergeant did not like that stuff because, as far as he was concerned, it was ineffective. You just use up flamethrower after flamethrower, but you're not getting on target with the stuff. So he decided he's going to use something else, and we began experimenting then with other stuff. We experimented with motor oil. Motor oil will burn,
Yeah.
but it has a very low intensity, and it has a lot of body to it.
Yeah.
So you're limiting your distance.
Right.
Because the motor oil is heavier than the gasoline, so it don't go anywhere. So we tried diesel fuel, and if you got too much diesel fuel, the same thing would happen with the motor oil, that you wouldn't go anywhere. But finally, just experimenting with it, we finally got a mixture, and I can't remember the mixture now. It's been too many years ago, I guess. But we mixed so much diesel fuel with so many gallons of gasoline.
Interesting.
And the gasoline at that time was only 82 octane.
Interesting. Okay.
That were used in Jeeps and trucks and vehicles. And so it didn't have a whole lot of intense heat.
Yeah.
And the gunner sergeant wasn't happy with that either, so being a gunner sergeant, he had access to a Jeep. The rest of us didn't have, but he could requisition a Jeep and go someplace, and that was okay.
Yeah.
But he disappeared one day with his Jeep. Nobody ever asked him where he was going, and he probably wouldn't have told him anyway. But the Jeep, has a very small back, but when he came back, he had a 55-gallon drum laying kind of half laying in the back end of that Jeep. And it was airplane gasoline, 130 octane airplane gasoline.
Wow.
And nobody ever asked him where he got it, and he never told anybody where he got it. So, but
that's the military supply system.
Exactly.
That's right, I understand.
So once we got that mixture, then it had a tremendous amount of heat, and some of us foolish enough to fire the thing into the air, and as we did, the air would kick it back, because you got fluid running from here to the fire, and it would kick it back. We lost, whatever hair we had on our arms and hands, and I've had my eyebrows seized, singed and so on. But we finally learned that you don't do that, and you certainly pay attention to which way the wind is blowing. Yeah, but we came up with the procedure, more he than us, that we'd shoot 15, 20 yards on the ground in about a 3-second burst.
Okay.
And it would just turn into a huge ball of fire. And that would, the forced air from the gun, from the flamethrower, would force it to roll.
Interesting.
It just didn't go out there and stop.
It kept going.
Yeah, it kept going because you had the air that pushed it. When it left your gun, it had power behind it, and it hit the ground, and it would just keep rolling. And but you had to get within 15, 20 yards in order. Otherwise, your flame is extinguished before it gets there.
Wow, interesting.
And so we began experimenting with that, and then he began requisitioning airplane gasoline.
Did those things kick? Did it kick like a kick backwards?
Whoosh.
So you're how much did you weigh back then, do you think?
I weighed 150.
150 pounds. So why did they select you to be the flamethrower?
Why do Marines do anything?
So here you are, 150 pounds. That sucker kicks. And if that were to knock you over and you fire straight up in the air,
it would have been serious.
You're going to burn yourself up.
Yeah.
Wow.
But you learn to give with it.
Sure.
And it's just like firing a machine gun.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well.
You learn to adjust to it. But we had to learn all that stuff, and then we got ready to go to Guam in June. We had probably 40 flamethrowers.
Wow.
We just kept requisitioning flamethrowers because we would service them all, have them ready to go with the match in it and the fuel in it, and it's all you have to do is pick it up and go. So we'd make up a whole bunch of those and just ship them.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And
because there's no way to reload. I mean,
No.
you just have to get rid of it and get another one.
Right. I mean, you're not going to carry an air cylinder with you.
Right.
Or some way of mixing fuel. You just couldn't do it. So that stuff would move with company headquarters. Wherever company headquarters was, that's where we kept all the demolitions, all the flamethrowers, ammunition, all that stuff stayed with headquarters.
And when we had breakfast in Austin last year, you told me, which I thought was really interesting, that you were obviously worried about what would happen if the tank was shot. So you did some testing.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we shot at it with M1 rifles and 30 calibers.
30 caliber.
Yeah.
And 30 caliber didn't
penetrate it. Now, it would cut the hose. You had a rubber hose with a spring in the hose. to keep the hose from kinking.
Sure.
But you could cut the hose in two with a machine gun.
And how much did that weigh full, approximately, the flamethrower?
70 pounds.
And you only weighed 150 pounds. So roughly half your body weight.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you trained on this thing in Guadalcanal.
Yeah.
As much as you possibly could.
Absolutely.
And figured it out. And then in June, you
Well, strange enough, when we got to Guam, they had pillboxes built on the beach area.
Okay.
To try to keep us from being able to land.
Right, on the beach.
But the Navy knocked most of those out before we got there with their big guns. Yeah. So we didn't have any reason or necessity to use the flamethrower because the pillboxes mostly had all been wiped out anyway. Yeah. Then once we got ashore and up on the high plain, we called it, now we're in jungle. And it is so thick.
Right.
Flamethrowers wouldn't have been any good because you wouldn't have had any place to shoot them.
Yeah.
You know, except set jungle on fire.
Right.
So I never used a flamethrower in Guam at all.
Interesting.
Yeah. After the first few days, we just quit carrying it.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah.
And when you weren't carrying that, were you carrying an M1?
Yeah.
M1.
Yeah.
Carbine.
Well,
or M1?
carbine was my assigned weapon.
Okay.
And I had to wear a 45 on your hip.
Okay.
So I had a 45 on my hip, and the carbine was my normal weapon. I didn't like the carbine. To me, it was not an accurate piece of weapon. So the minute I could find an M1 that somebody wounded had lost or somebody had killed and the M1 was available, I'd throw that carbine away and grab me an M1.
Upgrade. Because they are accurate and
Yes.
they do have a lot of power.
You betcha.
And so you in June, the campaign has started. The name of the campaign was Operation Forager, and that was basically the Mariana Islands.
Yes.
At that point, so that was Saipan and
Tinian and Guam.
And Guam, and so you were actually Saipan was you were in reserve.
Mm-hmm.
3rd Division Marine Division was the reserve, floating reserve for Saipan. And then you were the primary invasion force for Guam.
Yes.
And then so you were basically floating for quite a while.
Yeah,
through
we were
June.
off Saipan for quite some time.
You were on boats.
Yeah.
Waiting to find out if you'd be needed on Saipan as a reserve or if you would go to Guam as scheduled. And Saipan was sort of out of the way, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Kind of on the map, it was a little bit out of the way.
Yeah.
And so... and then while that was happening, there was a fairly major battle going on at sea, right? The Philippine Sea, there was a big Navy battle going on between the Japanese and the United States. And then finally in July, you all were called forward to invade Guam in July.
Right.
And so at that point, so this is your first invasion.
Real campaign.
First real combat that you're going into.
Yeah.
What did you feel at that point? Were you ready to go at that point, or were you nervous, or what?
Probably a little of both. There's always a lot of anxiety, simply because you don't know whether you're going to survive or not. And you do everything you possibly can to protect yourself and those around you, but there's always the possibility, and that's in your mind, but if you dwell on it, you lose your effectiveness.
Right.
Because you can't operate under fear. There is no way that you can absolutely have a great fear and continue to do what you're responsible to do. So I never would let myself get to the point where fear took over. But I would never let myself think. Now, to say it didn't enter my mind, it did. But to dwell on it, I never did dwell on the fact that I was not going to survive. I went the other way all the time. Every time I start to think that, get it out there.
You had enough mental power to push it out.
That's right. That's right. I'm going to make it. I'm not going to let them get me. You just keep thinking that.
And so how did that invasion work out in Guam? How was that?
Well, it really wasn't, for us, for our outfit, it was a pretty easy invasion, really. The first 5 days were the rough ones.
Okay.
We landed on the beach.
Were you in Higgins boats at this point? Did you land on Higgins boats?
No, no, the Higgins boats wasn't out yet.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, understood.
They were these pointed boats. I forget what they call them, but they were pointed, and you had to go over the side of the boat.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. When we hit the beach, we were still in the water. The bow of the boat was up on the sand.
But you were still.
But the troops had to all go forward and go off on each side up front. And there was water down here. You still went off into the water, but it was only knee to waist deep.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Then you waded on ashore and kept on going. But there was a big hill in front of us, in front of the area where we landed. It's now called Nimitz Hill. Okay. But at that time, it was just a hill. And the Japanese were up on top of it. And so they had all the advantage. They could see everything that was going on down here.
Okay.
And it was steep enough that once you got up to within, I don't know, maybe 500 yards, something of that nature, it was steep enough that they could just roll hand grenades down the hill at you, you know. And of course, they had their mortars back over the edge, back over the top of the hill.
It was zeroed
and the
in.
mortars come over and
Zeroed in.
you know, and their artillery. They had artillery that was firing onto the beach. So we attempted several times to move forward and climb the hill, but it was just so chaotic and losing so many people, we had to back off. And really, it took us 5 days in order to actually finally get to the top of the hill. And once we got there, they didn't have foxholes. They just were on top of the ground. We dug foxholes. That was one of the requirements, that when you stopped for the night, you had to have a foxhole.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was a 2-man hole. You always dug not a single, you always had 2 men. Because one guy's on watch for an hour, and the other guy sleeps, and vice versa. You go through the night that way. So somebody's always alert.
Right.
And we had each company or each platoon area had a section or an individual or 2 individuals really out in front of the line, the defense line, that were kind of the warning people. We'd put them out there, they'd dig a hole, and their job was to listen. And then if they heard Japanese coming and that sort of thing, alert the line. You know. And it's like a kind of like a forward observer.
Understood.
But this is at night.
Understood.
Daytime we didn't put them out there. Only at nighttime.
Because the Japanese would commonly attack at night.
Yeah. And you had to have passwords. You know, every night you got a different password, so that if you had to get off of the line, and when you're coming back, somebody's going to challenge you. What's the password? Yeah. Because you don't know whether the guy's a Japanese or who he is. You know. I remember they were using baseball teams, Dodgers and.
Yankees.
Yankees. No, I had never heard of those. I didn't know we had baseball teams. That's how stupid I was. So I had a terrible time remembering those names, you know. And a couple of times I said, well, this is Willie. That's what everybody called me.
Willie.
This is Willie. So they knew I wasn't Japanese when I said Willie. But one of the individuals that took my place as a BA Airman was in that forward position, and when they banzaied, we had several banzais while we were there on that ridge, 3, And they always came early in the morning, just about dawn, and they overran their position out there, and we lost him.
Wow.
Had I still been the BA Armman instead of the flamethrower operator,
Would have been you.
that would have been me out there. But that wasn't in the plan. Yeah. And it was it's such a strange feeling and really a strange experience that you can hear them coming and they're yelling and screaming and firing and all that sort of thing. Just like a herd of people.
Well, and a bonsai attack is sort of a all-out suicide type
That's right.
attack where their whole mission, they know they're going to die, but their goal is to kill as many
Right.
of you
Yeah.
as possible. And as you said before, it was honorable for them to die. It was one of their goals to die.
Yeah.
And in fact, surrender was illegal. You know,
That's right. They're afraid of.
in their military.
If
It was illegal.
Yeah.
And so you had that on that hill, which became Nimitz Hill eventually, because Nimitz made his headquarters there, right? Later on, that hill you had 3 separate bonsai attacks, and those were the most severe bonsai attacks on Guam.
Yes, they were.
At that point.
They were. Yeah, because they couldn't do that in the jungle. You know, they couldn't. They
Right.
couldn't run towards you in the jungle
Right.
because it was too thick. You know. So from once we got over the top of the ridge, and there was a open area for I have no idea how many yards now, but for a good distance, it was open territory.
Yeah.
So you jump up and run, hit the deck, and run, hit the deck, and but then we got to the jungle area. It became real thick, and the big advantage that they had was that they could camouflage themselves in trees. You couldn't see them.
Yeah.
I mean, they'd have leaves and
Yeah.
stuff all around them, and you didn't even know they were there. And all of a sudden, somebody beside you
Wow.
is hit. You don't even know where it came from. Yeah. One of the memorable things that happened in that jungle. Eventually, we got some machetes to where you could actually cut your way through the jungle
Jeez.
because
Yeah.
it was just that thick, you know. But at night, you couldn't dig holes in the jungle. There's too many roots
Too
and trees
thick,
and
yeah.
all that stuff, you know. So you just form a line and hold it.
Yeah.
And the aircraft had bombed those jungles over and over, and there were great big shell craters and where the bombs had hit.
Yeah.
And it rained a lot on Guam. It had a lot of rain. And those holes that the shell bombs made would fill up with water.
Yeah.
And you're coral rock mostly.
Yeah.
So the water is not going to
Right.
sink into the ground. It's just going to lay there. you
Right.
know.
It's gonna pool.
So, and yeah, just form a pool. So where the frogs came from has always been a mystery to me. There were frogs there, I swear, they were 5 and 6 inches in diameter. They're the biggest frogs I've ever seen in my life. And they would squawk at night, you know, make some kind of a noise. And every once in a while, one of them would get out of that water puddle and get into the jungle. And when they did, you'd hear noise that's not associated with water, associated with leaves or
Sure.
something. And somebody would hear that. Well, you don't know whether it's an enemy or what it is. You just hear a noise. So somebody would fire around, you know, at that noise spot. And as soon as somebody fired, then everybody starts firing.
Right.
I said, we probably wasted more ammunition on frogs than we did on the enemy.
You know, but nobody would ever know that or think about that. If
No.
you didn't just tell that story, nobody would ever know that.
No.
That's and the strategic significance of those islands was to build air bases that were close enough now for the bombers to reach
Yeah.
the Japanese mainland.
Yeah.
So very significant, because once we had those islands in our possession, we could now start bombing regularly Japan, because we were within range.
But if we hadn't had the 29, we couldn't have done that.
Right. The
You know,
29
the
was
24s and 25s and 27. They couldn't fly that far.
Yep.
But the 29s could because of the fuel capacity.
Yeah.
And to me, that was the real saving, as far as I'm concerned, of the war. Because if we'd have had to invade, it would have been terrible. Because everybody, well, I say everybody, but the training of the people of Japan were trained so that they had the same philosophy as their soldiers.
Everybody would die fighting.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it would have been, we would have lost a tremendous number of people had we actually had to land in Japan.
And how long were you on Guam?
We were there with security Guam on August the 10th, 44. Then we had to build a camp. We had to clear the jungle and actually build a camp.
Wow.
Because there was no place to go, no place
small
to
task.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as a demolition guy, and I wasn't the only one, of course, but as a demolition guy, I was the only demolition guy in my company.
Okay.
But there were, other companies had demolition people too. But we had to clear the area mostly with explosives.
Yeah.
And because you couldn't dig, the coral rock was just everywhere.
Yeah.
And you couldn't dig holes with a mattock and we didn't have any equipment
Right.
at that time to
Right.
dig
Right.
things with in the way of machinery. So we had to use explosives to blow holes into the ground for what we needed, like grease pits and heads
all that
and
stuff.
all that stuff. And we had to cut all the trees in order to put up tents
Yeah.
and buildings and all that. So we did that from August through December, really.
Wow.
We just every day.
That's hard work.
It was hard work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then by January, we had pretty well everything set up.
Yeah.
You know, the ground cleared, the buildings built. I remember water was a problem. There was no water there. And so we had to have water brought in, and they brought it in these little two-wheel buffaloes, we called them. And
I think we still have those.
Yeah.
I think we still use those. Maybe
Yeah.
the same ones.
Probably so. But they wouldn't last very long, you
Yeah,
know, when you're dealing with that number of people. And so we had our tents set up. Everybody in a tent. No permanent structure for troops. We had a permanent structure for mess hall
Right.
and heads,
Right.
and mechanical shop, that sort of thing. But the rest of us all lived in tents. And as I said, it rained a lot. So they decided they needed 50-gallon drums to catch water in so you could wash your clothes,
Okay. Yep.
then take a shower,
All
helmet
that.
shower,
Sure.
didn't have anything overhead. And so first we started out with a hammer and chisel and go all the way around a 50-gallon drum, cutting out the top of
Yeah.
the thing so you could fill it with water.
Yeah.
And it left real jagged edges all the way around because you're doing it with a chisel.
Right.
And so individuals were getting themselves cut on those things. You take a hell of a barrel to move it, and all these jagged edges would get you, you know. So we had a thing, an explosive thing called a Primacord.
Yeah.
It is explosive cord. We could cut trees with that stuff. We could do almost anything with it. It was very flexible. So I came up with the idea, why couldn't I use that? I'd been using it for everything else. Why couldn't I use that to cut the top out of a oil drum? So I took a piece of Primacord and went around all the way around the drum. Then I took dirt. We didn't have any sand, but I took dirt and piled it on the Primacord, put a fuse on it, lit it, and it would go boom, and that lid would just be cut off of there as smooth as this table. I thought that was miraculous. The smartest guy in town. I mean, it was just amazing. So we would then cut the top out of these things and set one at each corner of the tent. So when it rained, the water would run off of the tent into those.
Smart.
Yeah. So we had all the water we ever needed. So those things were overrunning, you know.
Yeah.
And every tent had one or two or three of them around their tent. So and it was good rainwater. Yeah.
It's amazing what you can come up with when you have to.
That's right. Yeah.
That's amazing. So you built the camp on Guam and you were living on Guam.
Yeah.
And then at what point did you receive some replacements at that point for the wounded and whatnot? Did you receive some new Marines that came in?
Oh yeah, we got those right off.
Okay.
Just as soon as we settled down and got the campaign, August the 10th, secured the island, then we began getting new Marines in to fill in the vacancies. Yeah.
And so at what point did you know you were soon going to be part of another invasion?
Well, it wasn't until, actually we didn't know where we were going until we got aboard ship. They didn't tell us that.
Interesting.
But we did know something around probably the 10th or so of February that we were going to ship out.
Interesting.
We were going to board ship and go. We didn't know where. And, but once we got aboard ship and got out to sea, then they began having briefing sessions up on the top deck that have a group at a time. You couldn't have everybody up there, but they'd have a group at a time. And they brought out a board, I remember. We didn't have plywood back in those days, but we had some kind of a hardwood board, wooden board, and they had drawn what looked like the size of, or the image of Iwo Jima on this board, just an outline, you know, and told us that's where we were going to go. And they did tell us the size of it. They told us it was, you know, about 2 miles wide and 5 miles long, and but we had no intelligence about the island. Nobody knew, I guess, because nobody had ever been on the island. The frogmen had cleared the mined areas around the beach area, but they'd never been ashore, you know. So we had no way of knowing the number of Japanese that they had there, or the miles of tunnel that they had tunneled out. None of that information was available. But with the size of it, compared to Guadalcanal and compared to Guam and Saipan and such a small place, they anticipated, and that was said. I remember them in the briefing saying it probably would last 2 to 3 days, and that we were the reserve unit. If they ever said the 4th and 5th Division, I don't remember that. We were just a reserve unit, and that we probably would never have to get off ship. We were just there in case, like we did at Saipan. We're there in case they need us. You know? And when we stopped, got reasonably close to Iwo, we were still way out in the ocean. We couldn't see the island. Couldn't see anything that was going on. We could hear explosions. If you're up on the top deck, you could hear explosions occasionally. And I think that, I've always thought that was the 16-inch guns going off. You know, rather than the bombs. I think when those big old 16 inches go off, They make a loud noise. Now, I've always thought that's what we were hearing. Occasionally, we'd see an airplane go by, a fighter, but very few, and no information. I mean, they weren't feeding us information
Nothing.
to say they've landed or they had so many casualties. None of that information ever got to us.
Wow.
No. So, but after the first day, about midnight of the first day, over the speaker of the ship, they announced that we were going to disembark at 0500.
Okay.
We'll have chow at 0300. And which meant we're going ashore.
Right.
I mean, that's what it meant to all of us. And so at 0500, we started getting off. At that time, we did have the Higgins boats.
Okay.
The Higgins boats had been enough of them that we could have Higgins boats there, and they'd used Higgins boats before with the 4th and 5th Division.
Sure.
That had Higgins boats for them. And so we're going to get off into the Higgins boats. But we have to get down the rope ladder. The water waves at that time were, whether I learned it then or later, I'm not sure, but they were running 8 to 10 feet.
Jeez.
And had Higgins boats just going up and down, up and down. And it was still really dark when we got off the ship into the Higgins boats. And once we got into the Higgins boats, of course everybody has to get below
Yeah.
the level of the bed of the ship, of the boat. And we went out to a rendezvous area where the Higgins boats were joining in groups. And eventually they were called waves because this group of 15 or 18 or 20 or whatever number of Higgins boats were going around and around, they finally would line up in a straight line, and that was a
Go
wave.
ashore.
They'd all go short at the same time. And so we got out there, the boat's just doing all kinds of dado, all day long because the waves are still.
Wow. Yeah.
And even to the point that it's splashing over into the boat. And the bilge pump that they have on those to take the water out of the bed couldn't handle it.
Couldn't keep up.
No, couldn't keep up.
Wow.
It was coming in faster and they could pump it out. So we had water slushing back and forth all day. It was a miserable, miserable day. Everybody got sick. I've said, I don't know whether I got sick from being bounced around on the ocean or somebody puked on me.
Well, and you were used to being on the water at this point. It's not
Yeah.
like this was your first day on the water, and you still got sick.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Everybody got sick. I mean, it was just so rough.
Yeah.
But then we had to go back aboard ship that night because we couldn't go ashore. There was no room.
Really?
The Marines ashore were pinned to the beach by the Japanese, and they had not been able to advance.
Wow.
So we went back aboard ship, went through the same rigmarole again, chow at 0300. I didn't eat. I couldn't. Oh, I was so sick.
Yeah.
But then we got off again at dawn and back in the Higgins boats and back out. And about noon that day, somewhere in the noonish area, why we got the signal that we could come in. Yeah, and the fourth division at that time had been able to break through the Japanese line that to where they could advance and get up around Mount Suribachi.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that was the room that was the space that we had to go into, was where they had been all the time. And there were so many lost Marines and equipment on the beach. It was just unbelievable.
Horrible. And so you landed finally in that 4th Marine sector. And at that point, did you have specific orders to move in a certain direction at that
Yeah.
point?
Yeah, we did. Now, we didn't have any flamethrowers. We were just riflemen at this
Yeah.
point. But once we got ashore, and we in the lower echelons did not know anything
Right.
about this.
Right.
But when we got ashore and worked our way up to the edge of the first airfield,
Yeah.
we stopped there, and that's where we were. We got there on the 21st, and most of the 21st we're still on the beach.
Okay.
The 22nd we began to move forward,
Okay.
and then on the 23rd, the day the flag went up, we had reached the edge of the first airfield.
And that was the day. That was the day that you earned your Medal of Honor.
Yeah.
On
Right.
February 23rd, 1945.
Right. Yeah.
And can you, I know you've talked about this probably thousands of times, but can you just go through what happened there that day on February 23rd?
Once we got to the edge of the airfield, that's where we were when the flag went up, and we were waiting for the orders to cross the airfield. We were going to become I think they call it the spearhead or the point
Attack.
of the attack, and we had to cross the airfield in order to do that. The 4th Division went around the bottom of the airfield next to Mount Suribachi.
Yeah.
So, of course, some of them did go across the airfield, but most of them went around the bottom of it. And the 5th Division was clear on the other end of the island, so they weren't involved in this airfield thing. But we got to the edge of the airfield. Then we got the orders to move forward. And going across the airfield, it was I don't know, yards, probably 300 yards, 300 yards, a long ways.
Yeah.
And there was no protection. The only protection you could find was a shell crater, where a bomb had been dropped or a piece of artillery had hit or something, and it would blow out a small hole. So you jump up and run and try to find something that you could dive into
Yeah.
to get a little protection, because we were losing Marines as we tried to cross the airfield. They had all the advantage because the guy doesn't have anything to get behind or under, or when he has to get up and go, even though he's bent over and running,
Sure.
he still is a target. So we lost a tremendous number of people trying to cross that airfield. And finally we got across the airfield, and once we got there, that is where they set up these pillboxes, great numbers of them, to protect the airfield. Now, strange enough, between the airfield and the beach, there were no pillboxes.
Interesting.
But on the other side, where they set up these facing the airfield, that was their protection. And so we got across the airfield. Now we're going to try to break through these pillboxes. And we get the orders to move forward, moving out. And you don't get up all at one time.
Right.
One guy gets up and runs, and the other guy gets up and runs, And we just, every time they jump up to run, move forward, we lose them. Because the enemy in the pillbox had all open field of fire, and all we had to shoot at, if we had an opportunity to shoot, was this aperture in the front of the pillbox, which is only about 8 inches
Right.
high.
Right.
Yeah. So we lost a tremendous number of individuals trying to move forward, and we'd move forward, then we'd have to back off. We'd just lose so many people, we had to come back to reform, and lost all a semblance of organization. Didn't make any difference who you belonged to or what outfit you were in. You were just a Marine, period. And so finally, the company commander, he had lost all of his officers except a couple. And we had lost all of our platoon sergeants, and most squad leaders, and we had PFCs being squad leaders, anything. And so he finally called us offline, brought us back to get us off of the line and to reform, reorganize, and that's when he called for this meeting of all NCOs. I'd been acting sergeant for months.
Yeah.
My time and grade had not reached to where I could be promoted to a sergeant, so they just made me acting sergeant.
Right.
But as an acting, I was not an NCO. You had to be sergeant or above.
Sure.
So when he called for that meeting, I wasn't going to go. I'm in headquarters with the first sergeant, and he told me that the CO wanted me there. So I went to the shell crater that they had gathered in, and got with them, and it was a huge shell crater, deep enough so that we could all get down in the shell crater below ground level.
Yeah.
So grazing fire couldn't see us or couldn't get to us, but that's where he was meeting. And I don't remember much of what went on that day. I don't know whether I thought I wasn't involved or not, because I'm not an NCO.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's where he asked me if I thought I could do something with the flamethrower. And the reason that he did that, I have always surmised. When we got to the beach, I had two individuals with each company, A, B, and C company. And those individuals were trained either as a flamethrower or a demolition guy. They could do either one. You know, they could blow something up or burn it up.
Right.
You know. But by this time that we're meeting in that shell crater, those guys are gone. They're all either wounded or killed, and I didn't know which. I just didn't have anybody left.
Right. Right.
And they don't tell you that. They don't. You know, they don't come back and say,
Yeah.
"Well, you just lost one of your men." They don't do that.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when he asked me if I could do something with the flamethrower, I'm the only flamethrower operator in C company.
Yep.
So I have no idea what I said. Afterwards, after we got back to Guam, some of the individuals that were there that day, and I didn't say it, they did, that my response was to the CO, I'll try. But that was my job. Yeah. So he assigned me, or told me to get 4 Marines to help me. Whether he picked them or I picked them,
You don't remember?
I don't have any idea.
Yeah.
I do know that 2 of those individuals I didn't know. Now the 2 that I went with me particularly, I didn't know because they were part of my squad.
Yep.
You know, and so I knew the 2, but the other 2, they were just Marines. And as I said, we had lost all formation. You know, you didn't know whether you were in first squad or third squad. Didn't make any difference. You were just a Marine. And so when we got those, myself and a pole charge man, and those 4 Marines, we had a real quick powwow. The pole charge man, we made up a bunch of these before we left Guam. We took a 2x2 piece of wood, about 8 feet long, put a 12-inch plate, wooden plate on it, nailed that thing on there, and then we were using, first we were using TNT quarter-pound blocks, which were very difficult to keep on that plate. But then they came out with composition C2, which were pound blocks.
Yeah.
And they're pretty good size. So we used composition C2 at that point and taped that on. I just used what we call duct tape today taped it on there, and put a fuse on it. We had a thing called a fuse lighter that you could just pull, and they'd set the fuse off, and you'd run down the line and hit the cap, and off she'd go. So we'd made up a whole bunch of those before we left Guam. And so one of the guys, he's my pole charge man. You go with me, get a pole charge, and go with me. Well, his job, of course, was if I burned out a pillbox, his job was to run in and put the pole charge in, set it off, make sure nobody survived. But he didn't last very long. He got hit pretty quick. And so, as far as I can remember, I didn't have another pole charge man. I had used demolition, but I didn't have a pole charge man to help me do that. But you could take these Composition C2 blocks were in a satchel with a strap that you could hang on your shoulder, and like a school satchel, you know. So you can carry one of those on your shoulder and still operate the flame thrower. Yeah, you got.
Jeez. At that point, it's already 70-some pounds. What's another 10 or 20 or whatever?
That's right. Yeah. There were 8 blocks in there, 8-pound blocks. So, you know. But you do what you have to do, and much of that day is just absolutely gone. I've talked to skilled people, professional people. Why won't my memory work? They don't have an answer either. The best answer I've ever had was a psychologist told me that if you decide you do not want to remember something, you will not remember it.
Yeah.
If you decide you do want to remember it, and you keep remembering it, then you will retain it.
Yeah.
But if you say to yourself, consciously or unconsciously, not important, I mean, there's whether remembered or not,
right.
You don't.
Right.
So maybe that's what I decided, I don't know. But I sure don't. I don't have any memory of how I got the flamethrowers, how I got the satchel shot. None of that will come back to me.
Your instinct took over.
That's right.
At that point, you're operating on adrenaline and instinct
and training.
And training.
Yeah,
and
you just do what you've been trained to do.
That's right. And that was, and thankfully there were people around you to see, you know, what you guys had done, because, you know, and you did this for hours.
Yeah.
Hours.
I've used the examples, good or bad, that if you're driving down the highway, whether you are speeding or not, you see a police officer's car on the side of the road. Your right foot goes from the gas feed to the brake, period.
That's right.
And you have no control of that. It just does it.
That's absolutely right.
You don't think of it. If you thought about it, you'd already be down to the policeman before you ever got your foot off of the gas feed. But it just moves automatically. Instinct just takes over and it goes. And you don't even know you do it. So that's the only comparison I can make to this thing, is that
instinct took over, and training, like you said.
Yeah.
Just like that, you train yourself to do that.
Right. Now, the first time, if you're driving a car for the first time and you've never done that, then you would have to think, I got to move my foot from here to here. But after you've done that so many times, it just automatically, there is no thought goes through your brain.
Well, and the amount of training that you did, you know, back on Guam to prepare.
Yeah.
That's what built that foundation, along with just your normal infantry training that you learned in boot camp and after boot camp. All of that came together, combined with the fact that you had been under contact. You were used to. I think I myself have been in combat, in the Middle East, and the first time you ever hear shots fired and bullets are coming at you, I don't care who you are, it's a little nerve-wracking.
Yeah,
I don't care who you are, and if anybody tells you different, I think they're lying. But after a little while, it almost becomes normal because your brain accustoms itself. And to your point, the human brain can mold itself to be normal in the worst of conditions or the best of conditions.
That's right.
So just like you were in hell, basically, your brain told you that was what was normal. Same concept goes for some rich person that's in a mansion, and all of a sudden the toilet stopped up, and it's the worst thing that's ever happened to them. That's normal. That's where their brain has accustomed itself to be.
That's right.
And I think when somebody gets in that situation, as you were in, your instinct took over. Your brain said, "Look, this is now normal. This is what we have to do." No. Well, it's very different, but it's the same concept as Michael Jordan hitting a shot at the end of the game and not being able, it's just what he knew to do, and that's just what you knew to do.
And if he had to stop and think every time that he tried to make a shot,
he
never would have made it.
That's right.
That's right. It just.
And that's the whole point of training. And at the end of that, you eliminated, I don't even know the exact number, but you eliminated many.
Well, 7 pillboxes.
Seven pillboxes over the course of several hours. And I imagine just your guys helped you resupply the flamethrowers so that you could, more flamethrowers.
Well, yeah. I don't think, I've jokingly said, I don't think any Marine ever said to me, once I used the flamethrower up, just wait there, I'll bring you one. I don't think that ever happened. I think I had to go back and get it somehow.
Go get him. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Just stay out there, we'll bring it to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that ever happened. But it,
well, it's that's the thing that always has struck me with what you did that day is, so many Medal of Honor have been earned with one action, meaning, spur of the moment, a grenade comes in and somebody jumps on a grenade, which, is tremendous heroism and sacrifice. But yours was over a long period of time, several hours, that you just consistently fought, came back, went back out, eliminated another one, came back, eliminated another one, assaulted each one. And so, really, in my opinion, any one of those actions, you probably could have earned. You took out 7 pillboxes, you probably could have earned 7 Medals of Honor that day. Each one was its own heroic act, and you just did it over and over and over and over again, which I think, is just something that's just never been done. And you look at all the different circumstances that came together for you to be in that place on that day, having been through all that you went through, and you couldn't join the Marine Corps when you wanted to, so you ended up doing it the next year, and all those things happen, and you ended up on that one place, that one day, that one island, which previously nobody had ever even heard of, and here you are.
Sometimes there's no explanation.
I know.
There is no explanation. Yeah.
And so after that, and I don't even know. I know a lot about your history, but I know you were on Iwo for the rest of the campaign, right? Which was basically 34 out of the 36 days.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And so you probably your unit was decimated. Your guys were completely decimated. Were you able to pull back after that assault on that first airfield, or what happened after that?
No, we moved forward.
Continued to move forward.
Once we broke through that line of pillboxes, then we were able to continue to move forward.
Okay.
And really, we were the first group to reach the northern end of the island.
Wow.
Yeah. Our company, C Company, was the first one to actually get to the far north of the island. I'll give you one more experience, and then we'll get out of here.
Yes, sir.
When we got to the northern end, I was carrying two. I didn't have flamethrower. In fact, I never used a flamethrower after February 23rd.
Interesting.
Never had any. Up in the northern part, they couldn't dig caves because it was too rocky.
Yeah.
So they hide behind rocks, and you could dig a foxhole, but you couldn't have caves and pillboxes and all that. But we got to the northern end, and I can remember walking down and sticking my foot in the water at the northern end of the island. Crazy thing to do, but did it anyway. But I was carrying two satchel charges with those 8 blocks in my satchel charges, and I had a box of caps in my pack, and of course fuse lighters and that stuff. And the word was passed to me, and where it came from, I have no idea. Didn't even know at that time, I don't guess. But anyway, they said that there was a cave just a little ways from where we were, where they had a piece of artillery that was on tracks that they could run out of this cave to the opening and shoot out into the ocean.
Wow.
In case they were coming from that direction.
Sure.
We didn't. We were at the other end.
Right.
But they had built it for that purpose, and that the word was passed to me that there were 300 Japanese back in that mountain, back in that cave, and they wanted that cave sealed. So I picked 2 Marines from my outfit, and I put one on one side of the opening of the cave and the other one on the other, with instructions: if anybody comes out of that cave, get them, don't let them come out. So I took the first satchel charge and put a 10-second fuse on it, and the cave, the sand had been leveled out in front of, there were no tracks, but had been leveled out in front of the cave, and then dropped off to the ocean. So I went up that incline to the flat surface where I could look straight into the cave, and I couldn't see anything in there. It was dark back in there, so I couldn't see anything. But I put a fuse lighter on it, pulled the fuse lighter, and I want to throw this satchel charge back in that cave as far as I can. Well, the best way to do that would be
underhand,
wind it up, like this, and throw it underhand. So that's what I did. I only had 10 seconds on the fuse.
Right.
So as soon as I pulled the fuse lighter and it started, I went like this 3 or 4 times and sailed it back in that hole, and then took off running. I didn't want to be in front of that hole when that sucker went off. I took off to the side and dived into the sand. And just as I hit the ground, I heard it pop. Just pop. I heard the cap go off. But it didn't explode.
Oh, jeez.
So, I don't know, had no idea why, but so I took the second one. And I did exactly the same thing, went back through the procedure again. As soon as I threw that thing in there, I took off and dived off to the side, and it went pop. Well, then I knew my caps had drawn dampness, and they were going off, but they were not setting the explosive off. So I yelled to those 2 guys and said, I'll be back, or I got to get some caps or something. So I went back to the company to get another box of caps. Now, they had those wrapped in this brown waterproof paper, so they couldn't draw dampness. So I took the caps that I had, threw those away, and I got me a new box and came back. I had to get another satchel charge because I'd used up the 2 that I had. So I brought a satchel charge with me, and the caps, I came back and did another one. and went through. This is my third time now, and I threw that one in, and took off. And then when that thing exploded, apparently, I got those so near each other that one went off, all of them went off. Holy cow! Lifted the whole face of that mountain off.
Holy cow!
I mean, it was a terrific explosion. You know?
Holy cow!
It just, you couldn't even tell there was a hole there when that thing sealed over. I mean, I just lifted enough sand up.
Cow.
It just closed the whole face of that mountain, you know. And whether there were any Japanese in there or not, never did know.
If they are, they're still there.
That's right.
Did you ever bowl later on in life? He had a pretty good motion. You would have been a heck of a bowler.
Well, I did bowl, but I was not very good at it. One of the reasons I could not bowl very well is I got this thumb cut off in an elevator accident with a desk. Had a metal desk.
Wow.
And we were loading it aboard an elevator, and it slipped off of the runners of a little cart we were carrying and cut the end off of my thumb. I could see it down in the elevator, at the foot of the elevator. We're on the first floor, and I could see that thumb down there, but there ain't no way I can get to it. So I grabbed my thumb, you know, it's just squirting blood every time my heart beats. My heart.
Oh, geez.
So I grabbed that thing and locked onto it. The guy who was with me, his name was Everett Gibbs. He was a Marine also. I said, Everett, you got to get me to the hospital. And I squeezed that thing as hard as I could. And as we went out of the building, he grabbed a whole handful of paper towels out of the restroom, out of the head. And when we on the way to the car, he's wrapping my hands in paper towels. You know? So it was only about a mile to the hospital. So when I got there, they, of course, put a tourniquet on it, locked it off. And they said, well, where's your thumb? I said, it was down there in the foot of that elevator. Oh, he said, where's your thumb? We can put it back on there. And I said, well, it's down there at the foot of that elevator. So, but my nerves on the end of my thumb are exposed, and so trying to throw the ball,
can't do it. Yeah.
That nerve, I'd hit that nerve, and I'd jerk every time. I put more in the ditches than...
That's okay. So, last two questions for you, and these are not military related. I was going to ask you, at what point in your life did you get involved with the horses?
Well, really, I was born and raised on the farm, of course, and we had no tractors. Everything was horse. That's the only way we could get everything done. So from the time I was knee-high to a duck, I was riding horses. I've ridden horses to where I'd be so galled between my legs I couldn't hardly walk because we had no saddles or stuff like that. And so I've always loved horses. And all my life I've always wanted a horse farm. Well, back in the late 60s, I'm thinking, I've got about almost 30 years in the VA, and I'm thinking, I got to have a horse farm. I just want some horses. So, and my wife agreed. She was kind of a country girl. Yeah. Her daddy they had gardens and chickens and all that stuff. Never did. Well, she had ponies. He had ponies early on. So we decided we'd start a horse farm. But it was just going to be riding. Just get horses so we could take a ride, you know. Yeah. But it continued to grow, and we got into the show business, and then raising horses and training horses. And for 35 years, I just did horses about every day of my life.
And your grandson?
Well, I had two grandsons come to live with me while they were going to high school. Yeah. Because both of them loved horses, and both of them became horse trainers. Todd and Chad became a horse trainer, but he finally got out of it. Yeah. But they both like.
And you still go to the shows sometimes?
Oh yeah. I just go watch anymore. But
well,
I enjoy it.
If you're out training at 97 years old, that would be a sight to see. And then the last question for you is just what advice would you have for young military leaders, for youngsters that are just coming up, given all that you've been through, what would you tell them going into the military and or going into life in
I get that question a lot, and my answer basically is that we only know what we are taught. Most of us have never had an original thought in our life that somebody else hasn't at some point in time thought of. And what we know has been passed on to us from somebody else. And in the military, you're going to be taught by those kinds of people that perhaps all their life they've had something in their background that encouraged them to become a military person. And if you will follow in their footsteps, if you have that same desire and follow in their footsteps, then you will be a successful military person. If you don't have that desire, then you're not going to devote your effort, your energy, and your ability to that occupation.
Makes sense.
It's once you have decided this is what I want to be, then it is very indicative that you do have that basic desire to be a successful military person.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Williams, for your time. This is unbelievable, and you're one of the greatest people that I know, and it's an honor to sit here
Thank you very much.
and talk to you, sir. Thank you very much.